If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the most creepiest or seemingly supernatural thing that ever happened to you? Ran away from a month-long canoeing camp, walked 20 miles without water and hallucinated Native American chanting and drums beating, wolves howling too. I was 12. A local man from an indigenous tribe came to talk to me when I was found and asked if I heard anything, as it was an area of land that was sacred to his people. Of course, no one actually believes me when I tell this story. Me and my mother saw a large, about 8 feet tall, bipedal gray creature run across a field outside our house. It had a really strange loping gait. If I ever bring it up, she gets really freaked out and says it must have been a deer, but I think she's mainly trying to convince herself. I know what deer look like, and this thing was walking on 2 legs for at least 200 yards. Was babysitting my little cousins. All were under the age of 5. I was 13. I put them to bed and went downstairs to watch a movie. The way their house was set up, the living room couch faced the stairs, so I would have seen if one of the kiddos had come downstairs. I had to walk through the kitchen in order to let their dog out. Everything was fine. Went back to the living room. Like 10 minutes later, dog wanted back in. I walked into the kitchen and every single cabinet in their kitchen had the door wide open. My cousin, the kid's mother, had warned me their house was haunted, but I didn't take her seriously. Just thankful the ghosts just wanted to mess with me instead of harm. Back in '76, I was camping with my friends and fiancé in a local forest. It was a dark summer night. I went to get more firewood when I heard a horrid scream coming from our camp. I rushed towards it to see what was going on. I saw that our tents were torn, my friends nowhere to be seen, and the love of my life laying in a pool of blood. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. When suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my side, I turned around and saw him, a tall dark figure in a work uniform. It was dark, I couldn't see his face, but I saw a horrid image I'll never forget. His empty eye socket stuffed with cotton. He tore the knife from my bleeding stomach and threw me on the ground. In the dying light of the campfire, I saw the name tag on his clothes saying Joe. Before he could finish me off, the sound of approaching sirens scared him off. He kicked me in the head and stormed off in an unknown direction. I barely made it. I needed a blood transfusion. Sadly, the other victims didn't. Sally bled out. They found Josh strung up on a tree with his guts hanging out. Mark is still missing. The worst part is, if it hadn't been for Cotton Eye Joe, it'd been married long time ago. Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? This is a true story my mom told me many times. 10 years before I was born, when my mom was 17, she and my grandma and mom were sitting on the couch one morning. In the living room. From the living room there was a small hall and you could see the whole house. It is a pretty small house. My uncle and my grandpa were away visiting family in Mexico. My grandma, who was tried from just having my youngest aunt, stayed home with the rest of the family. So they're in the living room talking. My grandma holds my aunt. And they see a little girl with long black hair. My mom feels something is off as the girls appeared from nowhere and ran into my grandparents' room. My mom and grandma ran to see, as they both saw the girl. My grandma checked her room. Nothing. There's only one way you can get in and out, a door at the end of the hall. And my mom checked my outer aunt, who was 9 at the time, and she was fast asleep. For the drier few seconds they thought it was my aunt, since she of course has tan skin and black hair, plus she was the only girl in the house who wasn't an infant. Of course it wasn't my aunt, she had short hair at the time. Plus there was no way she could get from my grandparents' room to her room. They checked the house and found no girl no matter where they looked. And strange thing is, my mom described how the girl seemed so unfazed by her surroundings, like she was running in's field, not a house. After no explanation to what could have happened, since they clearly saw the girl in their view for a good few seconds, they concluded it was a ghost. I was a skeptic at first, thinking it had to be my something else, but I still have not been able to conclude in an explanation that isn't supernatural. Maybe they saw a ghost from a little girl whose family lived in the area before Europeans showed up. I've been trying to find any info to see if my grandparents' house is near an old village. It could be that my grandparents live near a cemetery that's pretty old and dates back to the late 19th century. Up in Taoyabe, north of Yosemite, I was backpacking once and found a staircase. I had gotten a bit off track and was mildly lost, as I had had to go around a large snowdrift and was trying to find my way back to the main route. If you've ever been in the eastern Sierras after a big snowfall, you'll know that main route is a relative term. This was before these staircases started to be talked about online, but mine was a little different. It almost looked like a rock formation with trees outlining it. Like a trick of the eyes. Sort of like when you've been out there for a few days and you're absolutely sure you see a bear, and it turns out it's the way your eyes are perceiving a tree in the foreground shaping a stump in the background. But as I got closer, the shape became more defined, instead of less. I finally reached it, and sure enough, it was definitely a built staircase, not a geologic formation. It was crudely made out of bits of stone and wood, but definitely not natural. It was spiral too, so the top seemed to just disappear, even though I'm sure it didn't. I didn't have any sense of foreboding or fear, like people talk about online, but I did have the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. Sort of like hallowed ground or something? The most interesting thing is that I didn't take a picture of it. I'm a photographer and I have my camera with me at all times. But as others have said, there's sort of a time slip thing that happens. And you don't realize why, but you never climb the staircase and before you know it you're back hiking somewhere else. After I summited, I tried to find my way back, convinced to take a photo, but of course I never could find it. And not just the staircase, I have a picture in my mind of the entire scene and area surrounding the staircase, and I couldn't get back to anything even remotely like it. Not then, and not since. In 2011 my grandmother had cancer. She didn't want anyone other than her kids to see her when she was dying. She didn't want that to be our last memory of her. My mom flew down to Florida with her siblings to take care of her in her final days. My mom would call me and joke about the things she said while she was high on morphine, my favorite being "Where's a little bird when you need one?" On March 11, 2011 at 11:08, I walked outside to smoke a cigarette. I was playing on my phone for a bit before noticing it was 11:10, and I'd get to make a wish in 1 minute. I look on the table and notice a cardinal sitting inches from me. If you live near where these birds do, you know they aren't a social species. I started at him and even when flicking my cigarette it didn't fly away, no matter how close I was. I looked at my phone and caught the exact second that the time flipped to 11:11, and as it did the bird flew away. I shrugged it off as weird, and made my wish. I wish for my grandmother to not be in pain. My mom called a few minutes after and said my grandmother was dead. Her time of death was 11:10. It was more comforting than creepy, but it's amazing that it happened. I got a cardinal tattooed on me after, and ever since when someone I love dies, I see cardinals. Living at my grandparents' place after they passed away. They had a giant window in the living room that was always shut and locked. One day I saw the curtains lifting up 2-3 feet in a flowy kind of way. I walked over and touched it and it stopped. When I turned around to walk back to my desk I felt a cold, but comforting hand, touch my shoulder. Also had a chair with one those pump things beneath it. It would ping every time you sat down or got up. Heard it ping one time when I was asleep on the couch late at night. Then saw what looked like a person wearing a hat, Grandpa always wore hats, walk down the hallway towards the bedrooms. Other friends who stayed over in my grandpa's room would notice their lamp getting turned off or things falling off tables/shelves. About 15 years ago me and my friends used to have a homemade gym in a garage outside of residential areas. We were just a bunch of teens drinking, smoking, exercising and playing games every day there. One evening 4 of us finished a card game, left the cards stacked on a big pile, about 3 decks, and went to meet a friend at his house, about 15 minutes of a walk. We locked the doors behind us, big friggin' industrial steel doors with a huge bolt and padlock that would break your foot if you dropped it. We were the only ones with the key. We also blew out the candles we used as light source, as there was no electricity in there. We came back an hour or 2 later and were about to start another card game, but one of the lads noticed the cards pile was gone. One of the fellas screamed as he noticed he's standing right in the middle of ring made out of cards, with king and queen of hearts at his feet. We ran out screaming and our first instinct was to find someone older. We came back with a friend in his 20s, he was extremely drunk, yelled "Satan, come here, don't scare the kids, face me." Nothing happened. We stayed away from the place for months, but nothing like that happened ever again. I don't believe in ghosts, gods or mean spirits, but this still seriously bothers me. There was literally no access to the place outside of the key I've personally had in my pocket. One very dark morning in the deserts of New Mexico I was arriving for an early shift at about 4 a.m. I worked a few miles from a site where they tested/experimented on monkeys, and some say secretly on prisoners during the Manhattan Project. Ghost stories in this area abound, however I experienced it firsthand on this morning. As I was walking through the empty parking lot I see something out of the corner of my eye standing near the east side of the building. I look up and there stood a man with glowing eyes. Knowing there are lots of glowing-eyed critters in the area, my brain immediately tried to explain this as an animal standing on its hind legs. Terrifying enough, but at least it's not a man, right? Wrong. This man/figure/ghost creature waved at me and then motioned for me to come that way. Obviously, the answer was duck that, and I continued toward the entrance of the building clutching the knife I had in my pocket. Suddenly, the figure begins to run at me. I freeze and stand ready to fight for my life, but just as the figure gets within about 20 feet of me it vanishes. I was shaking from the adrenaline for about an hour and this has stuck with me since that day. I still have a hard time walking anywhere in the dark. So I was about 11-ish at my younger sister's soccer practice, like you do when your parents force you to go. It was in a place about 45 minutes north of Atlanta. My friend and I always used to walk around the woods while our sisters would practice and we would pass the time. There were a lot of trails in the rec park. So we would try to venture off. There were trails that had some swampy marsh parts too though, so we tried to avoid those. We ended up hopping the fence surrounding the field and going down this huge hill to a trail. We went across the trail through some woods for like 5 minutes and somehow ended up in this pasture area with a swamp in between us and another flat dry area on the other side. Looked strange because it felt kinda like a football field. About 100 yards apart, and where the end zones should be were the dry parts and 30 to 50 yards wide. We had just gotten there and weren't really talking, just kinda walking, when we hear something on the other side of the clearing. A full-grown deer is moving, the fastest I've seen a deer go. My friend and I turned to each other. Then we heard another noise, but it was much quieter than the deer. We looked back across, keep in mind we could barely hear it. What looked like a black force. Definitely hairy, but bigger than any bear I've seen even on TV, was effortlessly running at what looked like a faster speed than the deer. It was huge and so fast. It moved like it had long legs, but it wasn't high off the ground. I have no idea how to describe it. Long story short, my friend and I watched it chase the deer across the clearing, prayed it didn't see us, and ran like hell back through the woods, way up that hill, and hopped the fence. Freakiest thing I've seen. The apartment building where I grew up definitely had something wrong with it. It had been built in the early 1950s by my great-great-uncle, and I lived there from the time I was 7 until I was 25. Over the years I had several major experiences and many minor ones, and there was a general consensus among the long-term residents that bad things were afoot. My first personal encounter with the entity, because I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in demons, was when I was 7. I was sitting on the kitchen floor playing with my Barbies. I just happened to look up, and there, on our indoor porch, stood the lower half of a man. I can still remember exactly what he looked like: lean, with tan pants, shiny brown leather shoes, a tan blazer, and white cuffs with gold buttons, and fair-skinned hands. He seemed like he would be tall, but again, no upper half to be sure. He stood as if he were regarding me silently. Then he opened a see-through copy of my front door and walked out, closing it behind him. The last time I saw him was about 3 months later. I was outside with my mom and grandmother and, again, just happened to look over and see him standing at the corner of the building. His hands were clasped behind his back, and even though he still had no upper half, it looked like he was checking out the area of rot at our foundation. When I told my grandmother about him, she believed it was the ghost of my great-great-uncle. After that, I went years without seeing or hearing anything. Then, in my teens, things got bad. My mom and I would both feel a cat jump onto our bed's pressure, footsteps, everything, but my cat wouldn't be there. We'd go out and find him fast asleep on the couch. Then the footsteps began. Heavy, pounding footsteps in the unfinished area of attic over my room. For context, no one could have been walking there. My mom accidentally stepped on that area and put her foot through the ceiling. There was only insulation and ceiling tiles, no floorboards. Anyway, every night for roughly 2 weeks, this thing would stomp above me for at least an hour. I would get up to make sure the attic was shut, that our neighbors were asleep, that I was not being pranked. As I lay there in bed afterward, I would listen to the steps go in ways that it would take 2 people to successfully emulate from one wall to the opposite wall without crossing over. Starting in one corner and then stopping for a second only to pick up in a completely different corner without any way to have gotten there. As soon as I would wake mom up, it would stop, only to resume after she went back to sleep. Finally, one night, I convinced her to come into my room with me. It started up again and I woke her. I could tell she was scared, but she said, "Maybe it's squirrels?" As if angered, the entity reacted. My bed shared a wall with our living room, which was decidedly unoccupied. It was as if a huge man had balled his hand into a fist and slammed it as hard as he could against our wall without breaking it 3 times. My mirror rattled and we felt the shudder of the blows. Mom was up for the rest of the night with the lights on, and it didn't happen again. The other most overt incident happened around that same time. I had a thick, old-style TV in my bedroom with a little SpongeBob plushie sitting on top. I was watching something as I was trying to ignore the footsteps and fall asleep. All of a sudden, I saw with horror that my toy was moving closer to me off the edge of the TV set. It fell to the floor and I sprang out of bed. Thinking maybe I'd just put it too close to the edge after all, I turned on my light to check. Nope. There was a thick trail in the dust where this thing had been slid from the center of the TV top to the front. There was even a perfect roll of dust on the floor next to it. Shaking, I stuffed the plush into a box and went back to bed. But not to sleep. So I was driving down a country road. At the time I worked 2 jobs, so it was already dark when I started driving home. The road was really well lit though, and I had my brights on because nobody else was driving around me. Point is, I was alone, and could see the entire road perfectly. Out of nowhere something slammed into my side of the car with enough force to make me swerve into the other lane. It felt/sounded very large, but there was nothing in the road when I looked in my mirrors. The thing sounded person-sized and would have come from side of the concrete median, so how was there literally nothing in the road? I know it sounds bad, but I didn't stop driving. I was really scared and shaken up, so I kept going. I genuinely thought I killed somebody. There was a bowling ball-sized dent on my car's backseat door and a little juice-y bloody-looking stuff streaking everywhere. Like a big splat. Probably doesn't sound creepy to anybody else, lol. It just freaked me the duck out because there was no way I hit something that big without either seeing it coming or seeing it behind me afterwards. It literally sounded like I hit a grown-ass man, but it left a dent at the height of a kid. When I was younger, maybe 10 or 11 I'd reckon, I was at a friend's overnight birthday party. He lived out in rural Texas with probably 6/7 acres or so. We were playing hide and seek in his huge backyard, 10 of us, late at night around 11 p.m. He had a big above-ground pool in his backyard with an elevated walkway all the way around it. It was high enough that I could stand under it with crouching, but someone taller would definitely have to crouch. Anyways, it was my turn to find everyone, and as I'm looking around I see someone's silhouette crouched under the pool walkway. Like I said, you had to be pretty tall to crouch under it like this, so I thought maybe his dad had joined in or something. I started running over to get him, and whoever it was just books it to their fence line to the adjacent property and completely bounds over this fence, taller than me, in one step and takes off into the night. Keep in mind, even at that age I was pretty fast, played football, ran track etc., and realized immediately I'd never catch whatever that was. After that game I told everyone what I saw and nobody believed me. Later my buddy confided to me that sometimes when he was by himself back there he thought he would sometimes hear someone messing around near him. Pretty strange. No clue what it was, maybe some incredibly athletic homeless guy or something, but it just looked like someone in a black bodysuit basically. I lost my brother, he was 20 at the time, to suicide when I was 7 years old. He went pretty crazy before it happened and would threaten and abuse my older sister, 17 at the time. My brother actually snuck into our home twice and caught both times before he could get to her and was very open about wanting to kill her. Well, a couple of years after my brother's passing, while laying in bed with my sister on the brink of sleep, we both heard the door creak. I look over and see my late brother on all fours crawling to the side of the bed my sister was on. She screamed for him to leave and he crawled back out. She squeezed onto me and we didn't move the entire night. It was an awful experience and messed with me pretty badly. For years she and I slept in the same bed together with the door locked. We have always openly talked about it and the family is doing much better. My childhood home was haunted, and my sister and I really only found out towards the end. The house always used to terrify me, but my mother discouraged us from talking about it. In the months leading up to our move, she confided in us she always thought it was haunted, but she couldn't afford to move us until now. Lol, thanks mom. The closer we got to the move, the wilder shit got. And rather than like individually ducking with us, it started to duck with us collectively. So, we'd all be having dinner and suddenly all the cupboards would open in front of everyone. We'd hear footsteps as if someone was running through the house, but there was no one. Things would fly off shelves and tables. Again, in front of all of us and even sometimes guests. It feels surreal to have ever lived there. To set the stage, I lived in a rented home with my mother and brother. We had moved in about a month earlier and all of us hadn't really enjoyed the transition from our last house. This house was always cold, and the water took a long time to get hot. The walls and floors creaked and the doors were difficult to open and close properly. I thought it was terrible, but I was only 10, so what the hell do I know, right? We first noticed that our living room furniture would sometimes be out of place, especially one of our love seats. For whatever reason, sometimes in the morning or after we got back from the store or school, it would be moved a few feet out away from the wall, making it immediately noticeable as we re-entered the house. Also, the blinds in the master bedroom would never stay the way you left them. If you closed them, then when you got back they were open and vice versa. About a month into living here, the doorknob for the door that separated our living room from the entryway had the little tightening screw fall out, making it really easy to accidentally pull one side of the doorknob off as you are trying to open the door. The main event: a few days before, the entryway light bulb went out and needed to be replaced, but as it was about 10 feet in the air, my mother and brother didn't feel like replacing it as they were both pretty busy most of the time. Now my friends and I loved hanging out in my living room on the weekends as we would have the whole house to ourselves. So, on this particular Saturday, we were sitting around my dining room table playing a game when we all hear the doorknob on the outside of the living room / entryway door fall off and hit the floor. This had happened a couple of times at this point, so I wasn't initially scared in any way. I sigh and explain what the noise was to my friends as I walk across the living room and carefully open the entryway door. I go to turn on the light switch and remember that the bulb needed to be replaced. So I kneel down and start to feel around for the doorknob. I fumble around in the dark for a few minutes. At this point, I think that the damn knob is rolled down the hall or something and I need a flashlight. So I get up and walk back into the living room, explaining to my friends what I am doing, and walk into the kitchen, where the flashlight normally is. As I walk into the kitchen, the miscellaneous stuff drawer, the kind every kitchen has, is open, and sitting next to the flashlight is the doorknob. To this day I still get the tingling feeling down my spine as I write this. As I stare down at the drawer in disbelief, I notice I am shaking and sweating uncontrollably. I am barely able to stand, as I stumble back into the living room. And with great difficulty, I explain to my friends what just happened. Needless to say, they all lost their collective shits and we got the hell out of that house. A couple of months ago, I had the strangest dream ever. I was in the shotgun seat of a car, driving through my neighborhood in the night. The headlights were on, but they extended really short and for some reason to the sides of the car as well. There was a man driving, but it seemed too dark to see his face. The man just said, "Look. The pigs are dying." I looked out the window and saw some guy laying down, terrified and crying. I just knew, that his legs were being sliced open by a bandsaw. I looked around as we were driving, and there were more people being tortured like this. I asked the man over and over what was going on. All he said was that the pigs are dying. We pulled into the driveway of my house, and as we were slowing, the back camera display turned on, for reversing in newer cars. Through the camera, I saw some kids tied together and bound to chairs, crying. I asked the man if we had just run over those kids. He nodded and said, "Look. The pigs are dying." The worst part about it was this: I had gone with my family to Korea in the previous summer, and we had visited this place called Gyeongbokgung Palace. They have this museum where they show old Korean life, and my older brother and I had seen something funny on the display and recorded it. Just the day after I had the dream, I was scrolling through my old photos and saw the video for the very first time after recording it. I opened it and watched it, but then I noticed something. The display was covering traditional Korean superstitions, and there was one in the corner that had gone unnoticed by me originally. If the pigs start killing themselves in your dream, bad things will happen. When I was in my early teens, me, my mother, and my younger brother lived in a haunted house. It's kind of complicated to explain the layout, but it was a big old house, in poor condition, that had been split into 3 apartments. We rented the whole house. The upper apartment wasn't habitable. It was stripped to studs and the kitchen and bath were never finished. We used it storage. You could go up there on a summer day with sunshine streaming through the windows, and feel uneasy as someone might feel walking a graveyard at midnight. Being in there just made my hair stand on end. I won't even talk about the basement. It really freaked me out. So anyway, we always felt like the place was creepy, and coincidentally, we had some really hard times for our family while we lived there. So here's where it gets a little deeper. Long after we'd moved, my mother was at a dinner party at a friend's house. There was a couple there that were mutual friends of the host. My mother had met them briefly years before, but didn't really know them well. They had moved away and were back in town for a short visit. While dinner was being prepared, my mother was chatting with a man. Making small talk, she asked where they had lived when they were in town. When the man replied with the neighborhood, my mother said we lived on that area too. When he went further, naming the street, she replied, "Really? Us too?" When he gave the address. "Wow. That's something, we lived in that same house." The man looked kind of sad and serious and said, "We have some bad memories of that place." He explained that, very late one night, there was banging at the front door. His wife, who was very pregnant, rushed downstairs to answer. But as she did, she misstepped and fell down the stairs. When she got to the door, there was nobody there. As a result of the fall, she lost the baby. It was then that my mother remembered. One night, my brother, who was maybe 7 or 8, came into her room crying after having a terrible nightmare. She said that he was terrified. When he finally calmed down, she asked what the nightmare was about. Still sniffling, he said there's something in this house, and it wants children. If that's not enough, the house next door burned down. Years later, on the same block, a woman's body was found buried in a backyard, and there was a gruesome double murder of two sisters about 5 doors away. The whole block was cursed. I live in a forest, rural zone. Once, with some friends, I was chilling after playing D&D. We were calm and we wanted something to eat, so we called a local pizzeria. Everything was quiet, but when the call ended we heard a weird breath, heavy, loud and tortured. We thought that was a prank from the pizzeria employee, or an interference, so we continued to chill without thinking it was important. We heard a weird breath again. This time we started to panic, because the phone was off and we were home alone, so one of them gone to check. He never came back, so I gone to check. I saw his poor dead body with ripped legs heavily bleeding, laying close to a creature made of rotting flesh with a mouth opened in mid-head with no face. Last thing I knew that police came by. Used to live with a friend in an old house in the top floor apartment. We always joked that it was haunted and blamed any small issue on Uncle Peter. I was going to work one day and went to open the bottom floor door to get outside and it just would not move. No big deal. I thought to myself. We had changed the locks recently and the door also had a habit of sticking in bad weather. I double-checked the lock and tried again. Nothing. Now, I'm not a small person by any means. I'm clocking in at 314 currently, so imagine my shock when I was pulling with my full weight to open this door. It was unlocked, I know it was. I was heaving myself back as hard as I could and this door wasn't moving a centimeter. Finally I stopped and took a step back. Uncle Peter, please let me leave, I have to go to work. Reached out, turned the knob and the door swung open with no issue. Another story. I was sitting crisscross applesauce in bed with my kitty next to me when I had an itch on my leg. I reached over to scratch it and touched something wet. Looked down and what do I see? A drop of blood. First thought is that I somehow cut myself or my skin split from the dry weather, but my hands were fine and there was nothing on my leg either. Then I thought something happened to my cat, but I remembered that she was dead asleep on my own side, and had been for about 3 hours. The blood I touched was wet. Nevertheless I checked her over and she was fine, so I went downstairs to ask my roommate if she saw blood on me anywhere, and explained what happened. Here's where it gets fun. Roommate tells me that the other day she was on the Wii U playing Wii Fit when she felt something fall on her sock and looked down to see, you guessed it. Drop of blood. She assumed it was from a nosebleed, since she gets them often, and went through the same song and dance that I did looking for where it came from. The answer was nowhere. Nose not bleeding, no cuts, no nothing. She, like me, was blood-free. I went back upstairs to look at the blood and aside from where I smeared it, the splash pattern clearly showed that it fell from a height. The worst part was that night. All night long my cat paraded up and down the side of my bed with her tail flicking as she yowled at seemingly thin air. It all came to head in the middle of the night when I woke up to her hissing and told whatever was there to either kill me or piss off. Cat settled down not too long after that. One time I drove through some woods that don't appear to exist, and a 3-hour drive turned into nearly 4.5 hours. Without a wrong turn. So not ghosts, just mysterious and unexplainable. This story involves the same 2 friends as the previous story and takes place only a few months later, after we'd all started college. 2 of us were going to drive down to spend the weekend at our other friend's college. She'd given us very precise directions, telling us which highways to take and what towns we would pass through, even which towns we could speed through and which we couldn't. I drove since I had the newer car at the time. We knew the drive should take about 3 hours, maybe a touch longer, as we hit some Friday afternoon traffic on our way out of the city. The drive went off without a hitch. But once we were off the interstate and on the state highway, it just seemed to keep going and going. Before we reached the first town our friend told us we'd pass through. We didn't think too much of it. We still ended up passing through all the towns we expected to. There had just been a fairly long stretch of woods before we got to the first town. It was much later than expected when we got to our friend's college, but we quickly forgot about it and had a fun weekend. Late Sunday afternoon we headed back. The trip was 3 hours. At the time we didn't really notice whether or not we went through the woods. It was dark out by the time we were halfway home. The next time I went to visit my friend at her college, there were no woods and the trip took 3 hours. I've been puzzling over it ever since. True ghost story, I've started calling him Peter. When I was little there was a night light on my wall. The light was just enough for me to see into the hallway as the door was usually left open or cracked. I was always afraid of the hallway, since my room had a direct view of the bathroom mirror. One night as I lay in bed I start looking at the night light. It casts a bit of light up the wall it's attached to, as it should. However, directly above the night light was a shadow. It appeared male, but featureless. Even at a young age, you could tell that shadow couldn't be from the night light. After getting nervous and running across the house, one of my parents tucked me back into the bed. The shadow was gone. As I laid down fearful and peeked out from under the blanket, it was back. I slept with my parents that night, and hadn't seen the shadow again. The thing that followed my brother home. So little bro back in high school befriends this loner goth girl who invites him over. In her living room is a broken window taped over with sheet plastic. The plastic has long slashes cut into it, which my brother asks about. I conjured something, and now it's trying to get at me, she tells him. Little bro starts examining the cuts, theorizing about what kind of creature could have made them. How tall, how strong, etc. Knowing him, he probably said something smartass about it to try to hide his unease. He goes home, then goes to work. An hour or two later, our mom calls him and asks why is every cup in the house full of ground glass? Every single cup in the house is turned up and filled with ground glass. He didn't have an answer. He asked our mom about it sometime later, and she either blocked it out or pretended not to remember. But I found one of those cups when visiting home and having a smoke in the attic, undisturbed on a shelf where it had probably sat for years, full of multicolored, jagged shards of glass. Okay. So my house and my grandmother's house from my mother's side are attached, you know those old houses in India built in close proximity to one another, and at one point of time it was a single house. So the houses that genes live in, they can be living in between people and we won't know about it, except for tiny hints like table shifting in between night and all that, and they won't bother you unless you do something to bother them. And all the stuff that used to go on at my place happened at my grandmother's place as well. So there was balcony in one room. My relatives redecorated the room and moved the bed to different corner of the room, somehow blocking the way to the balcony, as that balcony was a sort of makeshift store room and they didn't need an access to it all the time. So, these renovations are going on and my relatives are sleeping in a different room. All of a sudden they heard a sound so loud the whole house shook. They thought it was an earthquake or something, which seemed the only logical explanation. They called other members of their family who lived in a different place to know about it and nothing came up. My uncle started looking around for any sort of damage or anything. When he went to that room he saw the bed has moved to the location in which it was earlier and the carpet was torn. Now look, I can't make you believe this story, I can only say that this really happened along with a lot of other minor things. But this was the most unexplainable occurrence and we could not debunk that no matter what. I am a person who spent a lot of my youth ghost hunting. I tried so very hard to find evidence of ghosts. And all my visits to haunted places earned me almost nothing at all. Only twice have I experienced things I couldn't explain. This is one of them. My two friends and I took a road trip after high school ended, staying in a haunted B&B at the first stop. I believe it was our second night there that we went downstairs late in the evening once everyone else was in bed and started poking around and taking photos, looking for ghosts or anything spooky or anomalous. We were in the front room when suddenly we heard the doorknob turn. We all froze, thinking someone was coming in late and would catch us messing around. The doorknob rattled and turned but didn't open. Now our thoughts had turned from ghosts, thinking that some stranger had come to the door and tried to get inside. A little frightened, we were relieved that the door was locked. We went up to bed more afraid of real people than ghosts. The next morning as the three of us left the B&B, we paused at the front door. After opening the heavy wooden door, we were confronted with the heavy glass door that usually screeched and slammed as it was opened and closed. None of us had realized until that moment that we hadn't heard it at all the night before. Only then did we realize that no one could have turned and rattled the knob without opening the glass door. At least no one from the outside. Strangely, we never talked about it afterwards, maybe a little too scared that we might have experienced something real. There's a body farm somewhere close by, real close. And that's what they call it, the body farm. People die. Their lifeless bodies are interred into the grisly forest hideaway, each is assigned an anonymous identification number. Some are situated to provide interesting decomposition vectors, while others are used to reconstruct specific circumstances for investigations. At any given time, several dozen bodies of perished persons are scattered around the hillside within automobiles, cement vaults, suitcases, plastic bags, shallow graves, pools of water, or deposited directly upon the earth. Except when clothing is necessary for a particular study, cadavers are disrobed, And frequently certain factors such as fire and chemicals are introduced to measure their effects. Then grad students from the nearby university and professors return periodically to check on their subjects' progress, with occasional visits from police officers or FBI agents. My dad used to be in Boy Scouts and went camping in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey once. His group came up to what appeared to be the foundations of an old house and decided there was a good place to camp. As they got into the night, things weren't feeling all that normal. Around 2 a.m, they all of a sudden were swarmed with millions of bugs and they were forced to leave. My dad says that foundation probably was the home of the New Jersey Devil, which had been locked up in the basement after being born with birth defects, and that the land still remained cursed. A friend of mine moved while I was in high school. His mom was selling their house, but he still had a key for a couple of months after they moved, and he stayed with me to finish the school year. So being a couple of teen boys, we used to hang out at his old house since he had a key. The house still had lights and running water, and a lot of the furniture was still there. It was a split-level house, with the living room and 2 bedrooms at the center, going up to the kitchen level, then up to a few bedrooms and the only bathroom. Important to note. He had always said the house was haunted, but I never thought of it until one time we hung out there with 2 other friends. I was in the living room with the other 2 friends and we decided it was a bit stuffy, so I got up to open the window, which had a crank to open it. I turned it for a bit to no avail, tried turning it the other way and still nothing. By this point all 3 of us were examining this window trying to figure out if it was possibly locked, and we heard a young voice right behind us state, very clearly, "That one is broken, it doesn't open." Thinking it was our friend, I started to say alright, thanks. As we all turned around, we heard the toilet flush, and about 15 seconds later, our friend came walking down the stairs to find the 3 of us standing around staring wide-eyed towards where the voice had come from. Our friend's response to walking in on us in that state was simply, "Oh, I see you guys met one of the residents." Another time the 2 of us were hanging out at the same house, and decided to play hacky sack in the basement. I kicked it wrong and it flew into a small side room I hadn't noticed before. Despite being broad daylight and having lights on, the room was totally dark past the doorway. We both decided against going in after it, and used a push broom to try and fish around for the hack, couldn't find it. I found a flashlight laying on a shelf and shined it in to look around, and even though the flashlight worked, it didn't illustrate that tent room at all. That freaked me out more than the voice by a long shot. My grandparents' house was 100% filled with spirits. So many unexplained things happened in that house. My favorite story to tell is one that I didn't experience but my mom, aunt, 2 uncles and grandma did. All 4 kids and my grandparents lived in a 3-story house with a walkout basement. Grandpa was out of town. The family decided to order pizza and watch a movie in the basement. They get the 2 boxes of pizza, sit down, start the movie. Each kid grabs a slice. There's 1 full pizza and a few slices of the first box left. They put the liter of soda on top of both closed boxes and start the movie. Their dog, a German Shepherd that had a track record of being really aggressive and mean, like killed the neighbor's goat and dragged it over a 6-foot fence for fun, couldn't be around strangers kinda mean, heard a noise upstairs and went to investigate. Got halfway up the stairs and turned around terrified. This was absolutely out of the norm for this dog, so naturally it spooked everyone. They all decided to walk out of the basement around to the front of the house. Front door's locked, good. They go back inside, search around the house, nothing. Everything seems fine. Sit back down, start the movie. My mom goes to grab a piece of pizza, takes the liter soda off the box, opens it, no pizza. Opens the second box. No pizza. The pizza was gone. All of it. They decide to go to bed and call it a night. Next week, Monster Vac comes out to clean the vents. Guess what they find in the vents? Pizza.